Good morning and welcome to our latest seminar in the Powermetrix Meter School. My name is Steve Hudson. I'm Vice President of Hardware Engineering at Powermetrix. I've been here for about 11 years and just wanted to talk about the ANSI C12 standard today. This is the last in our series of four for our COVID-19 webinar series 6. Today I mentioned we're going to talk about the ANSI C12 schedule. And so with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. Our agenda today, we're going to talk about, first of all, what is a standard? How does that pertain to me in my business? We're going to do an overview of the ANSI C12 committee, how it's set up, how it works, how standards come to be. And then finally, we're going to spend most of our time reviewing the current issues that are going on in ANSI C12. I will say this, I've been attending the ANSI C12 meetings now for about 8 years. I am a voting member. So as such, I get to see a lot of what's going on behind the scenes and get a good preview of that, of what's going on in our industry. To start out with, let's talk about what is ANSI. ANSI is an acronym, stands for the American National Standards Institute. Their mission from their website is to enhance both the global competitiveness of U.S. business and the U.S. quality of life by promoting and facilitating voluntary consensus standards in conformity assignment systems and safeguarding their integrity. Now, what that means in real life is they are basically exist to oversee the creation of a standard way of doing things to make life easier for everybody. And so if we really say what is a standard, standard is something considered by, if we look at that up in the dictionary, it's something considered by the general consent of a group of authorities as an approved model. So there's a couple of key words there. The first is authorities. What that means is when folks get together to make a standard, it's typically what I like to call the captains of industry, the people that have been in that particular industry for a long time, have a lot of experience, and as such know really the best way to do things. The next key word or key phrase there is general consent. So what that means is you get that group of people together. Really what they're trying to do is they're trying to agree upon a standard way of doing something. A lot of times that's one of the hardest things in creating a standard is just trying to get all those folks to agree. And so, just like in politics, a lot of times it ends up having to be, a thing where people give and take to get to the final answer. The standards group is made up of a panel of industry experts. In our case, for ANSI C12, we have 3 groups. We have utilities, equipment manufacturers, and other interested parties. Now, some important facts about ANSI. First of all, ANSI is not a government agency. What that means is that they do not have the force of law behind the standards. Now, other government entities like the Public Utility Commission can adopt an ANSI standard and put that into force of law, but ANSI itself is not a regulating body, meaning that it will not force anyone to actually follow those standards. All compliance is voluntary. Another interesting fact about ANSI is that they don't actually generate the standard. ANSI actually is a nonprofit organization that has a framework in which to actually create the standard. If we go ahead and talk about the C12 committee, C12 is one of many ANSI committees that oversees electricity metering. Each standard is controlled by an industry organization that's known as the Secretariat. Now, in the case of C12, the Secretariat is NEMA. NEMA is the National Electronics Manufacturers Association. That's an association made up of several different manufacturers of utility equipment. And NEMA basically has a person that comes together, brings together a group of people to organize the committee to propose and review the standards. There are several different standards that fall under the C12 committee, and we'll go through each of those. Those standards are published approximately every 5 years if they are active standards. If they are inactive standards, they may be renewed on a regular basis, but that typically means that they're actually not being updated. And we'll see there are some that have a lot of work going on. There are others that don't have nearly as much work. So if we actually look at the C12 main committee, we have 33 voting members with equal representation from the 3 groups. First of all, the manufacturers. That would be manufacturers of the meters, the meter sockets, test equipment, anything else of that sort. We have 13 users from the utilities. Utilities, of course, are the end user for the standard. And so as such, we really like to have a lot of utility involvement because they're the folks that are going to be most directly affected by this. Then we have 6 users from what we call general interest. That might be public utility commissions, other entities like the UL for doing certifications, and IEEE. These folks add a lot of other input in terms of how to do the standards, or things such as safety aspects of that. The meetings themselves are held as part of the Edison Electric Institute meetings. Those meetings are typically held twice a year in different locations around the country. It revolves, they rotate in terms of where they meet. The last time we actually had a physical meeting, trying to remember where we were at, but this year was actually different because of COVID-19. Normally we meet in person, but this year we ended up having our meetings online. A lot of the committee members actually liked that. They simply said, you know, it's nice, you're at home, you're in your easy chair, you've got your headset, you can adjust the volume. So it was actually quite interesting to hear folks' comments on that. We had a record attendance simply by the fact that anybody could attend. The only issue with, of course, traveling around the country is you have to pay for the travel, and so it made it a lot easier this year. So it was actually quite a welcome change to see it that way. So we'll go ahead and talk about the different committees. Now, C12, at the top of the chain is the C12 main committee. The main committee is in charge of overseeing all the subcommittees. There are subcommittees for different parts of electric metering, and so they break it down into certain areas, and like I said, we'll go through and talk about each of those subcommittees here in just a minute. Below the subcommittees are what's called working groups. The working groups are where really the main part of the standard is put together, and working group typically is only maybe 4 or 5 people. And you know, what I've found going to these meetings for several years is while there may be as many as 60 or 70 people that attend these meetings, there's really only about a dozen folks in the industry that really do the lion's share of the work in that. And so what you'll find is you'll see several names over and over and over again, both on these subcommittees and in these working groups. The thing about the main committee is it has the final approval for all activities for any of the C12 family standards. And so what that means is a working group, of course, will put together the meat of a standard. They'll pass that up to the subcommittee. Typically, it'll go through several different iterations before it actually happens. A new standard can take several years to come into effect. But by the time it's been reviewed by everyone, it's pretty much in a finished state. It comes up to the main committee. Everyone gets to vote on it. It actually goes out for public review and comment, and so people have an opportunity to go out and actually read the standard as it's going to be published and make comments on that. And I will say this about the ANSI C12 committee: they will look at each and every comment, whether it be positive or negative. Negative comments, they do try to work those out. They do put a lot of effort into, once again, trying to come up with a good compromise so that everyone is happy. The various subcommittees, as I mentioned, are put together to review specific standards, and each one operates slightly differently. They don't have a particular schedule in terms of when they're going to meet. They are usually the ones that are working on active standards. And so what will happen is when we meet twice a year, we usually meet over the course of a week, usually start on a Monday and go through a Thursday. And so we'll have anywhere from 1 to 2 hours to talk about things in each subcommittee. I mentioned these are part of the EEI biannual meetings, and so once again, that happens all around the country. They usually try to oscillate between East Coast, Central, and then West Coast, and so that way it makes it easy, ideally, for people all over the country to come to someplace fairly close on a regular basis. I mentioned the working groups are who's doing most of the real work. Now what happens is, of course, if you have 1 or 2 hours to talk about something, a lot of times a lot of the real hard work doesn't get done when we actually meet face to face. And so what that means is the working groups nowadays get together via web or teleconference to do that. You know, you'll usually have a chairman of the subcommittee, and then you'll have a head, an editor of the work group that will call together the work group, and then you'll have certain people getting together working on different parts, bringing that together into a document so that it can be easily reviewed. So let's go ahead and talk about the different subcommittees under ANSI C12. There are several subcommittees. Each subcommittee is responsible for a standard. By standard, of course, I mean a document that covers that. And so if we look, we've got Subcommittee 1, which was the original one. We'll go into detail about what that is here in a minute. Let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We have 12 really fairly active subcommittees right now that cover a variety of things. If you see, you've got the first 4 that have the actual standards listed. We have Subcommittee 24, which was a special committee that was put together just to talk about calculations, VA, VAR, VAR hours. Subcommittee 27, talking about meter upgradability. Note there is it's on hold. Sometimes a subcommittee will get together, they'll meet for a while there are any pertinent issues, and they'll actually go on hold. And so a subcommittee might just be a placeholder in case another issue comes up for that. So sometimes they'll be active for several years, and sometimes they'll go on hold for several years and then come back to life as new issues come up. Subcommittee 29 talked about field testing of metering sites. That's something that's very near and dear to us at Powermetrix. So that's one they've been working on for several years, getting ready to publish that as a technical report. ANSI can publish both things as a standard meaning it carries some weight, as opposed to a technical report. Technical report really is FYI, for your information. It's, once again, a list of best practices on how to do things, but it doesn't necessarily carry quite the same weight as a standard would. Here on the back end, we have some of the newest subcommittees. SC31 is dealing with a VA standard, trying to come up with a standard definition. Interestingly enough, we have a standard for the calculation of watts, but we've not had one for VA or VARs. And so as such, over the several years, we've tried to come up with a standard for VA. There's been a lot of work put into that, and I think that one's getting fairly close. One of the newest subcommittees that just met really for the first time last time was on DC metering. DC power, you hear a lot about that nowadays with the rise of electric vehicles, solar energy sites, microgrids, things of that sort, and so we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Subcommittee 46 is actually a very interesting one because that's a merger between C12, which is mainly a North American standard, and the OIML, which is an international agency that handles metering for other parts of the world. And then finally, C12 IEC 62056 is a new standard based on electricity metering data exchange. That's a new way of exchanging data based on meters, and certain meter manufacturers have chosen to incorporate that. So let's talk about some of the subcommittees in detail. We'll start out with Subcommittee 1, of course. Subcommittee 1 oversees the C12.1 standard, which is the granddaddy of them all, Code for Electricity Metering. This was the one that was first published way back in the early 1900s to talk about what is a meter. And of course, back in those days, they were talking about electromechanical meters. This meter standard, C12.1, was last published in March of 2016. The next publication date is targeted for 2020, for this year. Thus far, I don't know that that's going to happen. There's a lot of stuff that's been going on in the background to come into C12.1, and so it may happen this year. Our next meeting is in October, so we'll see if that happens then or not. As I mentioned before, sometimes it takes several years to get to the point of actually publishing a standard, just because there's a lot of work that has to go into it, a lot of agreement and disagreement that has to work out to a compromise. The meat of C12.1 is that it establishes acceptable performance criteria for new types of AC watt-hour meters, demand registers, pulse devices, and auxiliary devices. And so once again, really what that is it was really the definition of what is a electricity meter. And like I said, that standard's been in effect for many, many years now, several decades. And so it's gone through several different publication revisions over the years. What are some of the big things happening in C12.1 in the last published one? Well, one of the first things that happened was definition update of balanced vector diagrams. We actually want to update the vector diagrams to show how a balanced diagram should be affected. We now added bidirectional metering as part of the standard. Bidirectional metering, of course, a lot of times has to do with renewable sites where you can actually deliver or receive energy. If you all were in our meeting that we had back on Tuesday, we talked a lot about bidirectional metering and four-quadrant metering. One of the things that happened was we actually tightened up on the reference standards. Those are the power standards that are used to actually check the meters. They now have tighter limits, 0.05 and 0.02%, actually looking to perhaps go to a 0.01% someday. We also talked a lot about temperature rise based on a lot of the testing that's been done. Temperature rise has to do with a hot socket issue that you may have seen in the news over the last few years, and so we've worked to address that. We had an accuracy class 0.5 have been added for non-Blondell metering. There's been a lot of discussion, frankly, about Blondell and non-Blondell metering. One of the new standards will actually include a whole section on non-Blondell metering and how that affects the accuracy of the meter. One of the last things that's been done to the last update was new in-service performance update. That's Appendix D. It talks about sampling plans and how you should be monitoring your meters out in service to make sure that you're getting good accuracy and being able to show that that's being done. What are the current activities that are being discussed in Subcommittee 1? Well, the biggest thing right now is the merger of the C12.1 and C12.20 standards. C12.20 is really the modern version of the metering standard. It's the one that deals with 0.5, 0.2, and 0.1 class meters, and really that's the solid state meters. 12.1, as I mentioned, was back in the days of electromechanical meters. 12.20 was the more modern version of that standard. 12.20 has been around for several years, but we'd finally gotten to the point now that we see that not that many people are using electromechanical meters, and so finally the decision was made that we would put those two standards together in one standard, so that when you have to go out and buy the new standard, you just have to buy one instead of two. There's been a whole lot of work that's been put into that lately in terms of bringing that up to date. One of the other things that's been discussed quite a bit is demand testing. We're actually trying to get to a standard to actually define how demand testing is done. Been a lot of work and definitions of, for example, what is demand time? How is that defined? How is that measured? And so that's some work going on there. TrendWOG is a definition, is an acronym for the temperature rise group. I mentioned that one a little bit earlier, dealing with a hot sockets issue. Once again, that's been in the news quite a bit through the years, and so they've put a lot of work into what sort of things need to be done to be able to prevent that issue. The service switch work group has been going on the last couple of years. That service switch, of course, a lot of modern meters nowadays have a switch to be able to turn service on and off, and so as such, they're looking to standardize that. The auxiliary device group is a group that I've been part of for the last couple of years. A lot of work's been put onto that. An auxiliary device basically is anything inside the meter besides the metrology. For example, an AMI module. A big part of that group was basically trying to define a standard as to how the auxiliary device affects the metrology of the meter and how that's tested. That's been folded now into C12.1, so that will also be part of the new standard. Another thing they've been working on is a barcode update. Of course, a lot of meters have the barcodes on there to represent utility information, serial number of that, the form, the service type, the customer number, things of that sort. We're trying to standardize that to make it easier for those equipment manufacturers that use those barcodes so that they can write software to be able to do that in a more standardized fashion. And then I mentioned earlier, Section 5, which is the meter sample plan. That's been updated. We're continuing to add some more information to that to be able to make that more useful to folks. The other standard that falls under Subcommittee 1 is C12.10, which is the physical aspects of watt-hour meters. That's actually the physical, the mechanical part of that. Right now, that is under revision. We're updating with some new meter forms that have just been added in the last couple of years. Also talking about the pocket link clearances. If you're talking about the test links, those have never actually been formally defined, and so as such, there was some equipment that had some clearance issues, and so we're working now to try and make that so that that's well defined, so there won't be any issues there. Also talking about the meter blade tip locations. That's another thing that need to be updated through the years, and so that's being added to the new standard in 12.10. Moving on to Subcommittee 15. Subcommittee 15 deals, once again, with a lot of the mechanical aspects of that. One of the first standards that's under Subcommittee 15 is C12.7, which is requirements for watt-hour meter sockets, basically the definition of what is a meter socket. That was published back in February of 2015. That standard's been around a long time. One of the big things that happened there is all the figures have been updated. A lot of these figures were originally hand-drawn, and so now in the modern days of CAD, we're trying to get those updated so they look a little clearer, a little easier to read. C12.8 deals with test blocks for A-base meters. That's a standard actually that's getting ready to go away simply by the fact that we don't use a lot of A-base meters anymore. Certainly not a lot of new installations with that. And so as such, what we did was we took some of the test diagrams, some of the figures out of C12.8 and rolled that into 12.7. And so what will happen is once 12.7 is republished, 12.8 will be withdrawn, meaning it's no longer an active standard. One of the other activities that's going on under the subcommittee, the temperature rise group is also working on what we call a standard test socket. Basically, that'll be a socket by which they can do testing for standard activities of that sort. If we move on to Subcommittee 20, Subcommittee 20 once again was a very big, very active subcommittee in that it was overseeing the C12.20 standard. Once again, that's the standard for 0.1, 0.2, and 0.5 accuracy class meters. Really modern solid-state meters are covered under that standard. That standard was last published in April of 2017. Some of the major updates that went into that standard was that they had added the new 0.1% accuracy class with a bunch of new tests. We did have an update on the meter test port, the Type B optical port, trying to do some definitions on what's the best way to implement that. We updated the tables with both Blondell and non-Blondell compliant forms. Once again, non-Blondell metering, there's still a lot of that out there. Good old 2S meter. It's probably the most popular non-Blondell that we have. But just trying to educate people that you do lose some accuracy when you're doing non-Blondell metering. And so as such, trying to add more information to the standards to make folks aware of that, what conditions may cause that to be the case. One of the big things for us was that three-phase testing is now recommended and will be required as of the first of this year. That's really for what we call type testing of meters. Though, of course, out in the field, you can still do either three-phase or series parallel testing. One of the other big parts of the standard was harmonic testing. Harmonics are a big issue in the modern world. A lot of modern loads will generate harmonics. And so what the ANSI committee wanted to do was try to come up with a way by which to be able to test meters in a standard fashion to make sure that every meter got the same answer. Because back in the olden days, that wasn't necessarily the case. You might be able to take a highly harmonic load, put it on 2 or 3 different meters and get 2 or 3 different answers. And so what was done in the new standard was we added 6 new non-sinusoidal waveforms, basically with harmonic waveforms that you would see out in the real world that might cause issues for the meters. Some of the current activities going on in C12.20, the first big activity was, well, actually we're getting rid of Subcommittee 20 because guess what? We're merging C12.1 and 12.20, and so as such, that means that the new standard will fall under Subcommittee 1, therefore Subcommittee 20 was disbanded. Was one of the last things that happened. What that really means is that all the activities that were going on under Subcommittee 20 are now being moved to Subcommittee number 1. The optional extended temperature range was one new thing that's being discussed. Basically, that's a new set of tests for operating meters outside of their normal ranges. Of course, some meters are all over the world, and so as such, if they're in extreme temperature, it may not necessarily be the case that a typical meter would work there. And so a lot of the meter manufacturers have gone and tried to say, hey, you can actually use these meters in extreme ranges of extreme hot or extreme cold. And so now we're going to have some tests to actually be able to show how that works. What kind of accuracy can you expect over those temperature ranges? We also have the voltage interruption group. That was originally called the meter data loss group. What was going on there was that we had a couple of utilities that reported that meters were losing data because of transient events. It could be lightning, could be a power outage, could be a surge, something of that sort. And so a new subcommittee was formed to try and figure out, hey, what sort of voltage conditions can cause a meter to go haywire and lose its memory? And then we have C12.24. That's the old VA technical report, basically talking about all the different ways that you can calculate VA under different conditions. That report's been out for several years. It's now being revised and republished. Moving on to one of the newer subcommittees, subcommittee number 31 is dealing with measurement of VA and power factor. I mentioned a little bit earlier that right now there is not a standard definition for VA or VAR, also VA hours or VAR hours, under both sinusoidal and harmonic conditions. And so the purpose of this subcommittee was to actually come up with a standard definition for that. Really, right now the main focus is just to get VA done. There's a lot of contention over VARs. That one may never get done, but you know the big point of this committee is we're trying to get to a good definition of VA. A lot of the conversation lately has been on what's called source VA. That deals a lot for Delta services. Depending on how you actually set up the measurement, you can get some very different answers for that. And so we're trying to come up with the means by which to show how different measurement types under Delta services can result in different answers of accuracy. Moving on to C12.46. C12.46 is the integration of the ANSI and OIML metering standards. OIML is the International Organization for Legal Metrology, which basically covers most of the rest of the world beyond North America. ANSI pertains, of course, to North America. OIML covers most of the rest of the world. The purpose of this standard is to bring ANSI C12 into agreement with the OIML metering standard, which is IR46. That's primarily focused on accuracy class 0.1, 0.2, and 0.5 meters. It will include both watts, VA, and VAR, because the OIML standard goes into great detail about VA and VAR as well as watts. If you're interested in going to look at a copy of this standard, it's actually available for free on this website. So if you actually want to go out there and look and see that, you'll see OIML, they actually do quite a bit of testing over other conditions beyond what ANSI does. And so that's one thing that might actually benefit ANSI, in my humble opinion, is that the OIML will cover ways by which to bring together lots of other test conditions to give you a final answer. How does a set of different test conditions end up affecting the overall metering accuracy? Something else that folks see a lot in the news nowadays is DC metering. And so Subcommittee 32 was established to talk about how do we establish a standard for a revenue grade DC watt-hour meter and demand meter. The eMERGE Alliance is a third-party organization that's put a lot of effort into that. They've been working closely with Duke Energy to pursue this standard. eMERGE had been holding their own meetings separate from ANSI, and then just recently actually was brought into the ANSI committee. And so now we have some folks on Subcommittee 32 that came from eMERGE and from Duke and from other people that were working on that DC standard to bring that under the ANSI umbrella. They have a very good objective for this year, which is try to come up with the first published standard by the end of 2020. Once again, if you'd like to get more information on this, please go to eMERGE's website, www.emergealliance.org. So talking about the next set of meetings, I mentioned that those are normally held twice a year. If you go to the EEI's website, you can actually see where the meetings are scheduled for the future. Of course, with COVID-19, that's changed the whole world as we know it, and so right now they're still planning on having their meeting in October. That's from October 5th through 8th in beautiful Indian Wells, California. But of course, if we're still under travel restrictions, the backup plan will be to have an online meeting. And as I mentioned, that actually worked out pretty well, though I hope we do get to start traveling again fairly soon. If you are interested in ANSI C12, I recommend that you contact the secretary, Paul Orr. He's a nice gentleman, does a really good job of keeping us all organized. His email is pau_orr@nema.org. If you contact Paul, he can basically set you up to get emails talking about the standard meetings as well as getting preliminary versions of the standards. Here are some other web links that might be useful to you. ANSI.org, of course, talks about what ANSI is. It also has the ANSI store. I forgot to mention the way that ANSI is a nonprofit organization, so the way they actually make money is they sell the standards. And so you can go to that website to peruse all the different standards that are out there. NEMA.org, once again, NEMA is secretariat for ANSI C12. It has a lot of different manufacturers that fall under that association. So you can go there to get more information about that. And then finally, EEI.org has information on EEI. EEI is Edison Electric Institute. They hold a big meeting, once again, every twice a year to talk about metering as well as other things. Hold on just a moment.
So Steve, if you could summarize, how this latest version of the C12 and the last things that we talked about in the meeting, how would you summarize how it's going to affect the meter guys today and in the future?
That's a good question, Chris. As I mentioned, right now, there's a lot of involvement on terms of trying to integrate the standards. Really a lot of times with ANSI, what happens is a hot issue will come up, for example, harmonics. And so, what this standard really helps the average meterman knowing is, hey, when I go out into the field and I'm testing a site, it allows you to know, hey, I need to look for these particular things because this might actually affect the accuracy of my meter. The standard covers that. I also mentioned non-Blondel metering. Once again, a lot of people go under the assumption that a non-Blondel form will work just as well as a Blondel form, which isn't the case. I mean, you've got a 0.2% meter that under certain non-Blondel conditions could be off by a couple of percent. And so once again, the standards really help educate people as to understanding what are some of these issues that might affect my metering and ultimately the revenue stream of the utility. So I think that's really, the reason why these standards are important. All right, so once again, this was the last of this series of 4. We will be continuing the meter school starting next week. It will be our final round of meter school classes, and so stay tuned to your email to see what the next set of classes are coming up. Once again, thank you all for your time. If you have any questions, by all means, please use the web forums to contact us. We always enjoy your feedback, and once again, thank you for your time and hope everybody has a great day.